Early morning in Havenwood cast a warm, golden glow over the old facades of Main Street. The alarm clock rang in a simple house on the outskirts of town. Mark Carter, a man with a masculine face and a confident posture despite being amputated below the knee, moved routinely around the kitchen, making coffee and breakfast for his 16-year-old daughter, Olivia. His hands were strong, with the thick veins of years in the U.S. Marine Corps. Olivia, buttoning the sleeve of her sweater, smiled quietly at him, feeling in the air a special connection that united them despite everything. Olivia was a quiet, observant girl with a sharp mind and a delicate soul. She had inherited not only her father's strong character, but also his attention to detail in his work. Her drawings, filled with emotion, were a reflection of an inner world where no one was allowed except Renata Aldridge, her closest friend and loyal companion. On this November day, the first test was already creeping up on her with the noise of Havenwood High School, where the social hierarchy was a reflection of the shadows hiding under the perfect facade. The school had its own rules and divisions. A group of rich and powerful seniors led by Ethan Hayes had an unwritten right to decide who was worthy of respect and who would be the object of ridicule. Ethan, the son of the city's most influential developer, wore his status with the same pomp with which he wore a quarterback's uniform. His smile could charm, but his gaze could destroy, especially if he felt challenged. It was on this day, unable to bear Olivia's polite refusal after his offer to go to the school ball together, that he began to play a new, more dangerous game. Olivia, as always, tried to ignore the whispers and furtive glances. Her steel core showed in silent resistance, but beneath the surface was anxiety and fear that complaining would only make matters worse for her father, for whom every wound from the past remained an invisible but deep pain. Mark sensed that something was bothering his daughter, although she was in no hurry to share her worries. In the workshop, where the smell of fresh wood and varnish filled the air, he tried to find solace in the movement of his hands and the creation of new forms, but his heart was tormented, not by physical pain, but by helplessness and fear for Olivia. In those hours when the city was awake and alive, social media and conversations in the school hallways gave rise to small slights, quiet insults, frosty smiles, and half-hearted blows that made Olivia clench her fists and look down. She knew that much of it had to do not just with her, but with the man standing next to her, a famous veteran with an iron will and a visible vulnerability. Each day brought a weight, an invisible burden that she bore for Mark and for her own dignity. Renata helped her hold on, reminding her of the strength hidden in silence and inner fighting spirit. Meanwhile, Ethan's glances toward Olivia were growing uncontrollable, his gaze filled with the fury of a shattered ego, and the taunts behind his back were becoming more and more vicious. He initiated street talk about Olivia's father, jokes about injuries and fragility, as if he were trying to destroy not only the girl, but also her support system. This behavior did not go unnoticed by those who closely monitored the balance of power in Havenwood, but few had the courage to intervene. In this silent battle for respect, every step Olivia and Mark took felt like they were walking on a tightrope without a safety net. School life, with its shiny hallways and caustic whispers, served as a counter to the silence in the Carter workshop, where Mark tried to dare about the future despite the deep darkness of doubt that tormented his soul. He worked the wood with skill, every curve and joint of the parts a manifestation of his gift for work. But in moments of calm, his gaze fell on a photograph from Iraq, a reminder of what he had gone through for the peace and safety of his family. Yet the hardest battle was fought on the other side of the soul, in an attempt to protect his daughter from the pain he himself had experienced too deeply. In Havenwood, the atmosphere was softly thickening, like a harbinger of an approaching storm, and these first glimmers of alarm had not yet outlined the lines of the coming struggle. The seniors with their illusion of power, Mark with his constant painful concern for his daughter, and Olivia herself, with her unyielding will, were creating a complex fabric of history. The time was coming when the old walls of the city would no longer be able to hide the truth, and the first sparks of rebellion would find reflection not only in hearts but also in deeds. The tension was building, as if pulling everyone into an inevitable collision. But before that, Mark and Olivia were still clinging to their morning routine, to that small daily joy that keeps hope alive and keeps faith in the best. Their connection to the town and to each other was stronger than words and superiority, a foundation upon which something greater would grow. The shadows behind Havenwood's facade were beginning to thicken, and the whole complex mosaic was preparing for a change that would upend all notions of justice and courage. And so, when the school bell rang, inviting them to new trials, an invisible chain of circumstances was already beginning to unravel. Every whisper, every glance, and every frozen heartbeat formed a harbinger of the fall of the old order. Mark was wheeling towards the workshop, and Olivia, clutching her briefcase and carrying the burden of lessons and someone else's cruelty, did not yet suspect that this week in Havenwood would become the beginning of a story that could change their lives forever. Echo of uninvited words, autumn was painting the streets of Havenwood in shades of gold and red, as if nature itself was foreshadowing changes to the idyllic town. Olivia Carter hurried from home to school, her heart beating faster at every glance. The bullying that had begun subtly weeks ago was now gathering momentum, like a snowball rolling down the hill. She walked silently, her hands in her jacket pockets, trying not to attract the attention of Ethan Hayes and his companions, who were watching her with that sardonic smile on their lips that came with wealth and impunity. Ethan Hayes, surrounded by his friends, felt like he was in control. His loud laughter echoed through the school hallway, but behind that mask of confidence was the bitterness of defeat. Olivia's refusal to go to the school dance with him was the first crack in his perfect world, where his every wish was supposed to come true. Her polite but firm no was a personal challenge. The resentment gradually turned into anger, cold and cruel, directed not only at her but also at her father, Mark Carter, a veteran who wanted more than anything to protect his daughter. Each new mocking slash from Ethan hit the target like sharp arrows. He never missed a chance to mock Mark's disability, reducing all his merits to helplessness and weakness. Olivia, listening to these words, felt an icy fear creeping inside her. She pressed her lips tightly together, held her shoulders straight, but her gaze sometimes wandered to the side where her father stood, in the workshop, where he had first warned her about the dangers of open conflict. Fear for Mark, love and the desire to protect him from pain forced her to remain silent, plunging deeper and deeper into herself. At school, the silence grew more tense with each passing day. Even friends like Renata Aldridge tried to support Olivia, but they saw her become withdrawn and sullen. Renata noticed that the smiling, cheerful girl was now a shadow of her former self, as if she were carrying a weight on her shoulders that far exceeded her own. The truth was that at this moment she was afraid not only of Ethan, but also of the consequences of a possible showdown. Fear for her father, who already lived on the border between the past and the present, struggling with his wound and guilt. Mark, in his workshop, lived in two worlds. On the one hand, he created furniture from wood with a skill that brought him peace. Every movement of his hands spoke of strength and calm, despite the loss of his legs. On the other hand, an internal conflict tore him apart. He caught himself thinking that he could not fully protect his daughter, that years of service, battle, and injury now did not guarantee happiness and safety for those he loved. Sometimes his eyes would go blank as he looked at the instruments, as if they might provide answers that eluded him like smoke. But it was this inner world of Mark and his invisible strength that became the thread that connected him with Olivia, when the pressure of the outside world became unbearable. The father reflected on how Olivia tried not to complain, not to show weakness, because she was not just his daughter, but had gone through the trials of fate with him. Their joint struggle made their union stronger, and their shortcomings a chance to become better. But Ethan's growing mistake took on more and more prickly forms. After refusing to go to the prom, he changed tactics from whispers to open, loud insults. In the hallways of the school, his voice grew louder, and his words harsher. "Your dad is disabled, and you're just a shadow," he would say sarcastically when he thought no one would hear. But Olivia always heard, clenching her hand into a fist to hold back the tears in her eyes. Their life had become the stage of a never-ending play, in which she was the victim and he was the perpetual culprit. This aggression soon spread beyond the school. Ethan began spreading rumors that denigrated Mark's name, sometimes exaggerating stories about his service, as if trying to tarnish the veteran's glory, reducing him to an object of ridicule. They said that his injuries were nothing more than a source of pity, and that the entire family was a target on level ground, available for shooting. Olivia's isolation became deeper and more painful. She could not and did not want to distract her father, who was trying to keep the shop and his life under control. In the evenings that followed, Mark noticed the light in his daughter's eyes fading. His face reflected a cruel mixture of concern and helplessness. He tried to talk to her, but each conversation ended with unresolved questions. One day, watching her figure sitting on the veranda, he felt his own heart ache at his inability to stop the wave of evil rolling into their home. He was silent, but his fingers gripped the wood of the table tighter than usual, as if the strength for a future battle might be hidden in those bonds of wood. At the same time, tensions were growing at school. People from different social groups accustomed to the status quo began to see the relationship between Olivia and Ethan growing more tense with each passing day. A quiet but confident response began to spread among the students. Many saw more than met the eye, and some felt that the situation was beyond the usual school drama. Renata became a kind of island of support for Olivia, talking to her about how fear should not define her. Meanwhile, Ethan felt more and more pressure from his family and peers. His face, usually carefree and confident, began to distort with the ghost of irritation and undisguised indignation. He could not accept the fact that Olivia's rejection had left him in a vulnerable position. His orders to his friends became harsher and his ridicule louder. His pride, like armor covering hidden insecurities, increasingly fettered the inner voice screaming for change. Thus grew a turbulent storm between two worlds, that of an adult man who still struggles with his own demons after the war, and that of a cruel teenager whose power and privilege seemed eternal but were crumbling before her eyes. Olivia remained at a crossroads, between silence and a call for justice, afraid to hurt someone who had already lost so much. It was Friday, and with it the inevitable culmination of all the tension that had been building for weeks, about to burst into flames in the schoolyard, around the corner of the old parking lot. The winds of change were about to blow into the quiet town, calling for a final denouement that could not be avoided. And at that very moment, when the limits of patience were growing into open confrontation, the shadows of the past and present would merge to shed light on the truth. There came a time when words were no longer sharp enough to resolve the conflict. It was clear that intervention was necessary. But who would be the voice of reason that would stop the relentless onslaught and breathe a long-awaited breath of hope into this city? Soon, someone would appear on the scene, whose name would mean more than just authority. A man whose wisdom was stronger than brute force, and whose words were a weapon of greater scope. And as preparations for the coming storm reached their peak, Olivia silently clutched the key pendant around her neck, a symbol of loss and hope at the same time. Mark was in his workshop, carving a new piece of wood, knowing that soon, everything would change forever. It seemed as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when truth and justice would finally find a face. Intersection of the path. After the last bell rang, the air in the school hallways felt thick with unspoken words and mounting tension. Olivia quietly exhaled as she gathered her books into her backpack and quickened her pace, trying to avoid the centers of attention where the boy with the blinding smile, Ethan Hayes, usually launched his taunts. She tried not to notice his friends whispering and glancing in her direction, as if waiting for the right moment to strike again with words and gestures of cruelty. When she stepped out into the parking lot, an empty space after school, Ethan and his boys were already waiting. They stretched out across the asphalt like a pack of predators, menacingly blocking Olivia's path. Ethan's lips were curved into a smirk, his eyes gleaming with smugness and malice. His words were sharp and precise, cutting, leaving no hope for mercy. Olivia looked at her feet, feeling her heart warm with excitement and anger. Her hands convulsively clutched the straps of her backpack, her fingers white from the strain. She didn't scream, didn't beg. She was simply forced to endure in silence, trying to maintain her dignity and not give them a reason for new abuse. Deep down, there was a sharp pain, fear, and fatigue, but the steel core she inherited from her father didn't allow her to break. As if he felt guilty for failing to protect his daughter, Mark Carter received a call from Olivia before the end of the day, at the shop on that cold October day. Driving his wheelchair-accessible truck, he glanced at his watch and noticed the day was rapidly drawing to a close. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and the lines on his face seemed to deepen with worry. There was a growing feeling inside that something was about to happen, that he needed to be there. As the truck hummed into the parking lot, Mark saw his daughter awkwardly surrounded by 3 boys, The shadow of broken hopes and the inability to protect the olive light of his life had cast a shadow over everything. He stepped out of the truck quickly, planting his feet firmly on the ground, but not as a challenge. His heart was pounding in his chest. His hands were sweating. His face was imprinted with one thing: determination to meet the test. Ethan couldn't hide his superiority. He drawled mockingly, "So who do we have here? Baby Carter on a walk without a guard?" This was a harsh satire, thrown not into the air, but into the very heart of loneliness and pain. The other two laughed, teasing Mark, who was left to cope with his pride and steadfastness. Mark's hands gripped the edge of the wheelchair, tendons tense, knuckles white. His eyes sparked with an inner fire, the cold steel of the Marine Corps preventing him from slipping into humiliation. His voice, deep and calm, like an alarm, pierced the air. "Enough. Here and now." The tremor in his voice was more from internal struggle than fear. Mark's words caused confusion in Ethan's eyes. He quickly moved on to more taunts, descending into personal attacks aimed at the veteran's injuries and limitations. "You think your limp means anything? Where's your strength now?" Ethan asked sarcastically, forgetting for a moment his privileged safety. His arrogance sprayed insults like poison. Olivia stood next to him, a voice inside demanding intervention. But her lips were silent. Her eyes were shining with tears, but she stubbornly clenched her teeth. She knew that these words were hitting not only her father, but also herself, the world in which they were trying to survive together. Her hands were shaking, weakness was overcoming, but a readiness to resist flickered in her eyes. The situation seemed to have reached a critical point when Mr. Alistair Finch appeared from around the corner of the steel blue sky. His slow, confident step was like a comforting bell in the midst of a storm. He did not look young, but his every gesture radiated inner strength. His imposing figure immediately attracted the attention of everyone present. A few words, spoken quietly but powerfully, interrupted the flow of anger. "I think that's enough," he said in a smooth, deep voice that made the hooligans freeze as if they had been shot. Suddenly, the atmosphere around them changed. The tension dropped some of its weight, opening the door to truth and justice. Alistair pulled out his phone, not to record the humiliation, but to announce the powerful moral and legal pressure that was to follow. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. Reality suddenly became much harsher than his power play. He saw his family's reputation, his authority before the city's eyes, rapidly crumbling. His thoughts swirled, memories of his mother's words, business conversations, the fear of public shame. This moment was a turning point. People began to gather around. The eye could barely take in the mass of indignant and worried looks. With their power, Alistair's words created an invisible wall dividing the past and the future, where the old evil could no longer rule the roost. The sounds of the sheriff calling and the appearance of Daniel Hatfield, now tormented by the realization of his mistakes, added to the drama. Mark's moment of determination and courage drew on all the energy of his veteran experience and fatherly love. His silent fortitude, combined with Alistair's genuine support, created an invincible shield for Olivia. This episode became the point of no return, the first step toward healing the deep wounds of Havenwood society. The next chapter of history was already on the horizon, a time of recognition, punishment, and most importantly, change. There was hope that one day these evenings of spider shadows and malice would turn into bright days of unity and justice. But for this to happen, they had to go through trials that would change everyone involved. Voice of conscience. As the evening air around the school parking lot grew tense and Olivia was being cornered by bullies, guilt and fear cast heavy shadows over her clenching heart. Mark's face, illuminated by the flickering headlights of his truck, reflected both a hardness and a deep pain. His wheelchair slid harshly across the asphalt as he pulled out of the car, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The look of the teenager standing in front of them immediately changed from contempt to surprise and distrust. They did not expect that Olivia's father would risk intervening. But in Mark's soul, there was a fire burning, quiet and inexorable, awakened on the night when he first heard about his daughter's fears. Ethan and his friends began to hurl vitriol at Mark, shouting and chuckling. His service in the Marine Corps was a subject of ridicule. Some in the group made no secret of their disdain for his amputations, framing them as a sign of weakness. But Mark stood tall, his body tense, his chest clenched like a hot fist. His eyes gleamed with steel, an inner fire that would not rest. His jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck bulged, and his shoulders took on the unwavering stoicism of a protector. He didn't speak loudly, but each word penetrated deeper than lightning. It stops now. But the teenagers couldn't afford to appear subdued. Their arrogance only grew stronger. At that moment, it seemed as if a dark wave of hostility was about to cover everything. It was then that a dim but powerful voice lit up the street, calm and commanding, like an old clock in an abandoned library, steadily counting down the minutes of truth. The man many in Havenwood knew only from the occasional news story and book stepped into the light, as if from the very shadow of righteousness. Alistair Finch, the famous writer and keen observer of human destinies, walked slowly and confidently, breathing in the fragile chill of autumn. His figure inspired stability. One word he uttered pierced the silence. "I think that is enough." The hooligans froze, as if stunned, confusion spreading across their faces like early morning fog. Finch did not raise his voice, but his tone carried such moral weight that it seemed as if each culprit were in a terrible dream. Like an ancient judge, Finch became a symbol of unshakable justice. He looked straight into Ethan's eyes, slowing his breathing around him. "Ethan, your actions will not only damage your family's reputation, but also destroy your own future. Imagine the price you will pay if you lose the trust of not only your classmates, but the entire city." The writer's voice acquired a softness, but no less convincing. Pausing for a second, he slowly took out his smartphone and calmly, without a drop of threat, said, "Now I will make 2 calls. The first is your mother. The second is the editor of the leading newspaper in Wisconsin." This unexpected move, like a pronoun falling over, was a blow of a metal hammer to the fragile, illusory world of hooligans. The panic in their eyes was intensified not by fear of punishment, but by the realization that their impunity had been destroyed. Renata Aldridge, watching quietly from the sidelines, felt her heart fill with relief and new hope. She squeezed Olivia's hand lightly, which tightened like a spring in the hands of fate, where every second tightened the noose around her nerves. The gazes of the other students, hidden in the shadows of the building, began to refract through the fear of emancipation. This was a turning point not only for the Carters, but for all of Havenwood. After long minutes of silence and tension, the hooligans began to slowly retreat, their faces full of confusion and hurt, but no longer confidence. They looked at each other, feeling Finch's power seeping into each of them, softening the carelessness and arrogance. Mark watched the teenagers' reactions carefully. His brows drew together in sympathy and internal struggle, for he understood the complexity of the situation. But it was Finch's intervention that made him feel that he was not alone in the fight for his daughter's honor and safety. That moment gave strength to the things that had been living deep inside, long awaiting the outbreak. Mark held Ethan's gaze. There was no longer hatred in it, but an eloquent calm, as if it were saying, "Do what you must. I will stay." A new energy filled the atmosphere, spreading to everyone present like warm light breaking through autumn clouds. Shortly after the hooligans left, a heavy but cleansing silence hung in the air. Alistair Finch turned to Mark and Olivia, smiling the way a man might smile who had seen the power of truth in its purest form. His eyes, filled with the depth of years, radiated understanding and support. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "just speaking the truth in one voice can change everything." For the first time in a long time, Olivia felt the chain of fear in her heart break, and Mark felt a lightness, relieved that he would no longer have to fight alone. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a breakthrough that was both stunning and reassuring. Night settled over Havenwood, painting the streets in shades of blue and silver. A caravan of long conversations and reflections followed the final chord of this scene. Mark and Olivia walked slowly, holding hands, their shadows falling in long lines on the cobblestones of Main Street. Alistair walked beside them, like an old sage ready to guide them on the path of redemption. This was not the end, but only the beginning of a great movement that would soon touch the hearts and lives of all residents. The sky promised change, and with every breath the determination to move on would strengthen, despite all the trials. It became clear to them that their fight was a rallying cry for all of Havenwood. There would be hardships and open wounds ahead, but with a new ally and a shared commitment to justice, The bridges of destruction would begin to mend. Hope hung in the air, woven quietly into the rustling of fallen leaves. This night was a testament to how words and moral authority could spark a chain reaction of change, the very radiance that breaks down the walls of arrogance and renews humanity. And it seemed as if the very ground on which the heroes stood was already preparing to support their steps in the next chapter of their journey. The price of privilege. Mark Carter slowly looked up from the padded letter he had just received in the mail. His fingers, accustomed to fine woodworking, trembled slightly from strain, but not from weakness. Inside the letter were words that made his daughter, Olivia's heart clench like a vice. The parents of Ethan Hayes and the other teenagers had been summoned to the school immediately. Their names rang out like a death sentence. Mark took a deep breath and remembered how the local newspaper was already full of headlines, and the video of Mr. Alastair Finch's unexpected intervention was going viral. The immediate threat of public exposure was a heavy burden that was now weighing on the family of privilege. Every minute of waiting until the doorbell rang seemed like an eternity. Renata Aldridge walked into the room, solid and clear-eyed. She was Olivia's rock, the person whose words helped her hold on and see sense even in the deepest darkness. "We are all in this together," she said softly, "and the truth will be on our side." Mark nodded, seeing the steel in his daughter's eyes flare again. Those simple words were like a shield against a relentless attack that had seemed insurmountable. Meanwhile, in a more posh part of Havenwood, Cassie Montgomery, Ethan's mother and one of the most powerful businesswomen in town, was holding a parent-teacher conference. Her face was coolly professional, and she was conflicted. Her rage was directed not at her son's moral actions, but at the damage to her reputation. "We must act quickly and firmly," she said desperately, "because if word of Alastair Finch gets into the paper, our business could go down the drain." Her voice was like a hammer. Sheriff Longfellow Grayson, a man of hard experience and a kind heart, walked into the school's ceremonial hall, where several dejected parents and school administrators were waiting. He knew this was more than a legal proceeding. "The guilty will be punished," he said, "and it will not be a mere symbolic reprimand." His words sounded like a death sentence, but they also held a glimmer of hope for change. Among those present were several high school students, including Daniel Hatfield, who had previously stood on the other side, but was already seeking redemption through grueling hours of community service. The responsibility fell heavily on the shoulders of Ethan's parents. Cassie, caught at a crossroads between mother and businesswoman, was forced to acknowledge the obvious. She called her husband, who was also furious, but now faced a new challenge, finding a way to control the situation, to save not only his reputation, but also his son. In their conversation, the coldness of rationality fought with the incomprehension of the consequences. It was a desperate clash of two worlds, business and the reality of teenage mistakes. While their parents debated strategy, the teenagers who had previously hid behind the corporate shadows were faced with a new level of responsibility. Community service, ordered by the sheriff, was not just a punishment, but a lesson. Daniel, one of the most active participants, told his friends about the hard work he had to do to serve the community. He spoke of seeing the streets of Havenwood for the first time in a way he had only glimpsed before, unadulterated, with deep problems that needed to be addressed together. Meanwhile, Olivia, freed from the grip of fear, began to slowly emerge from the shadow of bullying. Students who had previously silently watched the cruelty began to speak out in her defense. In this slow movement, a new force was born, the force of unity and mutual support. The school hallway buzzed with talk of changing traditions, and old fears were replaced by a burning desire to fight for justice. Mark, watching his daughter, couldn't help but notice how the city's media was filled with stories and confessions. His workshop was filled with new energy when an invitation came from a major company to create specialized furniture for people with disabilities. It was not only recognition of his craftsmanship, but also a symbol that his physical limitations did not tie his spirit and life's possibilities. Mr. Finch's legacy as a calm, dignified observer was evident in all of these changes. His intervention was a catalyst that exposed layers of hidden problems in the city. Finch not only called for accountability, but also showed how important every voice, every action, was in shaping a new, kinder society. His reputation and words cut through arrogance and privilege like the knife of bitter truth. The meeting between Ethan and his father after the first days of hard work and awareness was tense and full of unexpected revelations. Despite the harshness and coldness, a spark of conversation about change and responsibility was born between them. The businessman began to see that it was impossible to save face by hiding the mistakes of the younger generation. This began a long and painful process of redemption that gradually changed not only Ethan, but his entire family. Havenwood, uniformly covered in autumn leaves, was gradually changing. Social tensions were giving way to lively dialogue and new opportunities for those who had previously been silent. In this transition, each person found their place and an understanding that behind the surface of light and idealism, there was a network of struggle, pain, and hope that could reveal the true strength of community. Little by little, the threads of responsibility intertwined into a strong knot of support and respect. Mark and Olivia felt that they were not alone. Their journey was just beginning, and new trials and victories awaited around the corner. But now there was a light ahead, which emanated not only from their efforts, but from the changes that affected the entire city. So slowly approached the moment when history would call forth a new chapter, a chapter of redemption and new beginnings, where courage and acceptance would be an integral part of the path to unity and hope. The rise of New Hope. Havenwood was suddenly buzzing with discussion. The story of Olivia and her father Mark, until recently a quiet family drama, became the property of not only the school corridors, but also the entire city community, thanks to the intervention of Mr. Alastair Finch, whose authority caused an unprecedented resonance. From the first days after the incident on Friday, school life changed. Lessons were no longer just subjects, but a platform for conversations about fairness and respect. Olivia's classmates, who had previously been afraid to speak out, felt a powerful surge of solidarity and began to open up. Olivia, harboring the cruelty of the relationship, endured the terrible burden of silence. But now her image has become a symbol of an unbroken spirit that has inspired many. Together with her faithful friend Renata Eldridge, she participated in school events where she talked about her experiences, preventing bullying from taking root in the hearts of other teenagers. The support of friends and peers gradually restored the girl's strength, making her more confident and open. Social media was filled with warm words and stories of overcoming difficulties. Many students who also experienced hidden bullying began to share their experiences, which became an important part of the recovery of the school community. The conversations in city cafes, on Main Street, and on social media have captured the attention of even those who had previously passed by youth issues with indifference. A local newspaper that had previously been muted in its coverage of city news devoted an entire article to the Carter family, highlighting not only their ordeal, but also their desire to rebuild their lives despite the pain and injustice. The confession opened the door for many in Harvard to the real life of Mark, a hero, a humble furniture maker whose work and courage became an example to those around him. The article took the discussion of social justice to a whole new level. Community support was an important emotional anchor for Mark and Olivia. They felt that their pain was heard and understood. Every warm glance on the street, every friendly gesture was a reminder that any obstacle can be overcome by working together. Meeting neighbors, talking to Renata, and even short conversations with passers-by gave the daughter and father a sense of belonging that had previously seemed lost. This unity became not just a comfort for them, but a light at the end of a long and dark tunnel of injustice. Slow but noticeable changes were taking place in the school environment. Teachers began to pay more attention to students' emotional health, and the principal made bullying prevention programs mandatory for all classes. Support groups were created where teens could talk openly about their problems and ask for help without fear of judgment. This transformation reflected the school's desire to become a place where everyone was allowed to be themselves without fear of peer judgment. Openness and understanding gradually replaced the previous climate of fear and alienation. Renata Aldridge became a true ally to Olivia. Her determination to help her friend was evident in every conversation and project they had together. Renata was a voice for those who could not talk about their pain, and together they organized the first meetings where students could exchange stories. Thanks to her attention and support, many children realized for the first time that they were not alone, and that together they could change the situation. This feeling of unity inspired them to fight for their rights and to resist injustice in any form. The Carter family, despite all the support, continued to experience difficult moments. Mark often returned to his workshop after a busy day, where every movement of his hands reminded him of painful memories from Iraq and of the battle that was not yet over, the battle for the peace and happiness of his daughter. His thoughts disturbed his peace, and his heart pounded when he imagined the invisible dangers Olivia faced at school. However, together they found the strength to move forward. The strong bond between father and daughter became a stronghold in this stormy ocean of trials. At the same time, a new dialogue was sparked in the city about challenging centuries of prejudice and stereotypes. The story of Ethan Hayes, one of the most influential teenagers, became a study in privilege and responsibility. The community service he began doing with Daniel Hatfield slowly pulled them out of their bubble of arrogance, changing their view of the world and their place in it. The lessons they learned were harsh but honest, allowing them to see the truth beyond the fancy houses and sports fields. Havenwood residents began to understand that true strength lay in the ability to confront injustice and change. The city, as if awakening from a long slumber, was preparing to embrace a new moral compass based on respect and support. The shift seemed small, but it was a profound act of rebuilding a community spirit that had previously seemed fractured. Each step forward strengthened the hope that change was possible, and that even the most difficult problems had solutions. What began as a story of pain and fear was now turning into a story of hope. Olivia was becoming a voice for change, and so were many others. Their examples inspired more and more people to open their hearts and listen to each other. New ideas and projects followed, promising to make Havenwood a truly unique city, where everyone could find their place and be heard. This was just the first step, bold and profound, on a long journey toward a brighter future. The potential for this transformation seemed limitless. City festivals and community events became platforms for dialogue and education, not only about anti-bullying, but also about the importance of supporting each other on a daily basis. Mark and Olivia felt like a weight had been lifted from their shoulders as they witnessed these changes. They realized that their struggles had not been in vain, and that their story served as a beacon for others still seeking the strength to rise. It gave them a powerful motivation to move forward. And so the change born of a simple act of courage began to spread like a wave. Teens, parents, teachers, and community leaders were drawn into a common process, ready to make life in Havenwood better and kinder. The courage of one man ignited the hearts of many, calling for responsibility and genuine compassion. It was the beginning of a new era in the life of the city, an era that promised true unity and justice. And soon these changes would find their loud main event. The hard road to repentance. With each passing day, community service became an unbearable reminder to Ethan of the reality beyond the barricades of his family's privilege and power. The weight of broken bricks and the smell of fresh paint on the school fences seemed out of place in his life of comfort and control. The first hours spent under the watchful eye of Sheriff Longfellow Grayson left barely visible scratches on his skin, but they penetrated much deeper into his pride and self-perception. Every movement, from slowly lifting stones for road repair to wiping dust off park benches, was accompanied by a grunt and an inner resistance. His gaze often slid to the blue sky as if seeking salvation in the horizon. Working next to him was Daniel Hatfield, a once quiet classmate whose reserved nature was matched by an active desire to improve. His seriousness outweighed Ethan's irritation, and this began to slowly awaken a feeling of respect. Suddenly, conversations with Daniel became frank about family, mistakes, and fears. For the first time, Ethan heard words filled with genuine regret and the power of change. These conversations tugged at his memory and caused internal dissonance, forcing him to doubt himself and his actions. The time spent thinking became heavy, like a weight on the shoulders of veteran Mark Carrere. Though father and daughter were far away, their pain was felt just as keenly here. Even more difficult was his relationship with his mother, Cassie Montgomery. Her pragmatism and cold attitude almost physically pressed on Ethan, leaving no room for weakness. In her eyes, he was a project, a threat to the family's reputation that needed to be fixed. The comments and harsh remarks did not sound like love, but a fear of loss and failure. These words cut into Ethan's male core, but they were the ones that made him think about his role. In a tense conversation before dinner, when his mother demanded a progress report, Ethan felt the need to admit his mistakes for the first time. His voice shook as he tried to convince her that this was not just a punishment, but a chance to learn what it meant to be a real man, beyond luxury and capital. Silence answered his words, but his own reflection in the plate of crisp apples already looked different. Not like an untouchable heir, but like a young man on the cusp of change. Meanwhile, Mark Carter watched his son change through the lens of his own experiences. Seeing Ethan, once the embodiment of anger and power, now absorbing life's lessons, gave his father a rare sense of hope. The workshop, filled with the scent of fresh wood and the silk of the lingering rays of autumn sunlight, became a place of peace for him. Each new project reminded him that strength does not come from muscles, but from fortitude and the ability to create. Olivia, in turn, increasingly felt the support of Renata Aldridge, her close friend and ally. Together, they made plans to implement ideas to combat bullying at school and beyond. Talking to Renata gave her the strength to open up and see the light at the end of a long tunnel. Renata's words were like little sparks that lit a fire inside her, chasing away the darkness of fear. The fear that her father would always remain vulnerable was gradually replaced by confidence in liberation from the shackles of the past. In this whirlwind of events, Ethan increasingly found himself thinking about the upcoming conversation with Mark. The internal conflict between the desire for rebellion and the desire for redemption made his heart beat faster. He understood that the conversation would not be just a dialogue, but a battle in which real men are revealed. Not with weapons in their hands, but with honor and truth. Carter was a symbol for him of many unspoken lessons about courage and responsibility. Finally, the long-awaited evening arrived. In the small kitchen of the Carter house, filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and finely carved coasters, Ethan and Mark met face to face. The veteran's eyes, full of the wisdom of wounds and pain, carefully studied the young face that was hardly ready to accept the world beyond social barriers. Mark spoke quietly, but each word hit right in the heart, forcing Ethan to think about the cost of his actions and the possibilities of correcting the past. The conversation was long and difficult. Ethan was not used to opening up, but under the gaze of someone who had lived through his own battles and wounds, he began to let go of the wall of defensive anger and arrogance. It was at that moment that the restrained empathy turned into a sincere desire to change. A lesson was learned that strength is not power, but the ability to take responsibility for one's actions, and that the highest virtue is to admit mistakes and move forward. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to demonstrate through his own example that redemption was possible, even for those who had previously seemed lost. His journey was a reminder that change begins with small steps and leads to profound internal transformation. For Ethan, it became a beacon, pointing the way, though difficult, to a sure path. Havenwood residents began to see the fruits of change. The atmosphere in the school and the town was changing, as if an invisible hand was pushing out the shadows of deception and fear. Stories of Olivia's resilience inspired other students of today and tomorrow, raising their voices for justice and respect. Newspapers reported on it, and people began to see each other again, not through the prism of privilege, but as equals on a common journey. In the hardware store, Mark received an unexpected offer from a large company specializing in developing furniture for people with disabilities. This chance became recognition of his skills and a symbol of a new life, full of not only struggle, but also creation. For him, this meant not only professional success, but also the restoration of faith in himself, lost after the injury. The gradual changes that came to family, school, and community life were living proof of the power of courage and integrity. The people of Havenwood were learning to forgive and accept, and at the same time, to build a future where everyone had the right to dignity and respect. There was a spirit of change in the air of autumn, promising that true strength comes from unity. With the city's anti-bullying festival approaching, everyone was preparing for an event that could bring people together and mark a new era. Excitement and hope filled the streets, and the heroes' hearts became brighter. Olivia was preparing to give her speech, where she would talk about the power of the spirit, and the starting point of positivity, laid by actions and changes, would light a spark in everyone's hearts. Ethan planned his speech with emotion but sincerity. When he took the stage, his words would be an example to many that change is possible, and that taking responsibility is the beginning of the path to redemption. His place is here and now, among those who have suffered pain and those who seek to heal wounds by uniting destinies. Under the gaze of Mr. Alastair Finch, an old writer with a deep understanding of human nature, and Mark, standing by with pride and inner strength, this moment will give birth to a new chapter in Havenwood's life. Their silent presence symbolizes support and the belief that even the hardest road leads to the light. The story continues, gathering together the threads of struggle, forgiveness, and hope for the best. Light breaking through autumn. The autumn sun softly illuminated Havenwood Square, where hundreds of residents gathered today to witness an event that promised to be a symbol of change. The anti-bullying festival transformed the city center into a living kaleidoscope of color and emotion, uniting everyone under the banner of hope and overcoming. Performances were already being prepared on a makeshift stage, and familiar faces flitted through the crowd amidst the laughter and conversation, each with their own story. On this special day, Mark Carter stood outside his studio, decorated with autumn garlands and crafts that symbolized perseverance and creativity. His eyes lit up with quiet pride as he watched Olivia appear around the corner. She had changed, now with a confidence that came from deep experience and personal overcoming. Olivia smiled at her father, and there was a fire in her eyes that only he had ever seen in his studio. Ethan Hayes walked onto the stage as thousands of people stopped to listen. His clothes were neatly pressed, but there was a tremor in his movements, as if he was still getting used to his new role as a young man who owns up to his mistakes and takes steps toward redemption. His voice, shaky at first, gained strength with each passing minute as he recounted his journey through mistakes, bitterness, and pain. "I had to learn that privilege is not an excuse for indifference, but a responsibility," he said, and people listened, transfixed. Olivia walked onto the stage with ease, leaving behind the isolation that had gnawed at her soul a year ago. Her speech was filled with the pain of the bullying she had endured, but also with inspiration from the strength of spirit she had gained from supporting her father and finding allies. Next to her stood Renata Aldridge, her best friend and loyal supporter, whose eyes shone with pride for Olivia. "Each of us can be a light that cuts through the darkness of loneliness and fear," she declared, and the audience exploded in applause. Mr. Alastair Finch watched from the shadows, smiling slightly. His imposing figure seemed almost integral to the day, a symbol of the town's wisdom and moral compass. When the party reached the point of Thanksgiving, he stepped to the microphone, his deep, calm voice filling the air. "Today, we see that strength is not in fists or status, but in the ability to change and lead," he said, and people felt as if those words were opening a new chapter in Havenwood's history. In the crowd, Sheriff Longfellow Grayson listened intently to every word. The cop who had punished schoolchildren for bullying a year earlier now saw how important his role was, not just as an enforcer of the law, but as a defender of justice. He exchanged glances with Ethan's mother, Cassie Montgomery, whose cool, businesslike facade had softened under the changes wrought by the events of that fall. She saw more clearly now that true strength came from openness and responsibility. Among the festival's participants was Daniel Hatfield, who was undergoing his own personal redemption. Community service had forced him to face reality, and today he stood next to Mark and Olivia, receiving hope for a new life. His words were brief but heartfelt, reflecting an acknowledgement of his mistakes and a willingness to change. In this unity of disparate destinies, Havenwood showed that the path to recovery always begins with one step, the step of understanding and acceptance. As the evening wore on, the lights of the festival took on a new light reflected in the eyes of those present. Mark and Olivia were alone for a moment, feeling the weight of the past month slip away, giving way to the light of an autumn evening and the warmth of unity. Their hands met, strong, confident, having known both pain and hope. Under their gaze, the city came alive, promising a future where every voice is heard and every story matters. It was not just the end of a story. It was the beginning of a new chapter for an entire community that had found the strength to change and help each other grow. The light shining through Havenwood's autumn chill was a reflection of the inner light of its people, born of courage and compassion. And somewhere deep inside, Mark knew that one choice could illuminate the path not just for one person, but for many who were still searching for their strength. As dusk fell, the festival moved into its final touching moments. Olivia and Ethan promised to continue the fight not with words but with actions, and Mr. Finch stood by, quietly looking at the younger generation he believed in. This meeting of generations, filled with hope and fortitude, embodied the central message of their shared journey. that change is possible when people open up to each other and act together. Gradually the square emptied, but in each heart there remained a fire that no one could extinguish. The history of Havenwood continued, passing on lessons of courage and compassion to the next generations. And as the autumn leaves gently rustled under the feet of passers-by, it seemed that even the wind whispered of the new hope that now lived in every home of this special town.